Hello and welcome to the Sci-Fi Christian. I am Ben DeBono, here to talk about the final 6 cantos of Purgatorio. That's right, we are finishing up Purgatorio and ready to move on to Paradiso. I can see my dog inches away from running into my tripod, so if the camera goes haywire momentarily, that is why. Alright, so kind of an interesting section of Purgatorio. If you thought Dante was, dealing a lot of metaphor and symbolism before, you were wrong, because he ramps it up to 11 here in these cantos with the big procession that we have and everything. We'll of course talk about that. If you thought that when we finally met Beatrice it was going to be all sunshine and roses, you were wrong, because she is not very happy with Dante when he first encounters her, and now that they're finally in the terrestrial paradise. So it's an interesting closeout to Purgatorio, because it's both represents the first point, that we are, out of dealing with sin in the sense of either the 9 circles of hell or the 7 terraces of purgatory, but yet in another sense, there's a lot going on here that does kind of deal with Dante's own personal journey, and in a sense, these 6 cantos kind of summarize that, especially when Beatrice goes back and talks to him about, what were you doing? You loved me and then I died and you just kind of went off the rails and everything. And so she's, she kind of recaps the journey for him, but then also prepares for the glory that's going to be encountered in Paradiso. So this is very much a transition section of Purgatorio and of the Divine Comedy as a whole. So, we'll kind of do recap and symbols all in one, because I don't know that you can really recap what happens in these cantos without talking about the symbols, because the symbols are especially when we get into the procession and everything, that is just enormous. So Dante, Virgil, and Statius are, all palling around and everything, and we've gone through the fire, we're now in the terrestrial paradise, and the first person they see a young woman. If you think that it's going to be Beatrice, not quite yet. This is Matilda that they see. And she is standing on the other side of the river Lethe. And the 2 rivers here, so there's 2 rivers, or one river that forks. There's Lethe and I don't know how to pronounce the other one. Eunoe. It's Greek and it essentially means good thoughts, good mind, that type of thing. So there's these 2 rivers. And this is, first we have to understand this symbol, of course, because in case you didn't catch it in the text, what happens is when Dante goes through the river Lethe, his memory of sin, all of his sins, is completely wiped away. And then when he goes through Eunoe, his memory of his good deeds is returned to him. The river Lethe, for those of you keeping score at home, is the river that flows all the way down the mountain of Purgatory and into Satan's domain there at the bottom of the Inferno. So an interesting symbolic pairing in the final cantos of Purgatorio and the final cantos of Inferno. But to start out with, in the section we read today, Dante is still on the remembering, I guess you would say, side of the river, where he has not yet passed through Lethe, and Matilda is on the other side. So he meets her, and then, she kind of talks to him a little bit, and then we get into, in the next canto, we get into this processional. Now, hopefully, if you're reading the John Ciardi translation, you made good use of the notes here, because if you didn't make good use of the notes, you're very, very confused. Essentially what's going on is that, we begin with these 7 torches or 7 flames or whatever that symbolize the 7 virtues. Then we see 24 elders coming up, and they are representing the books of the Old Testament. Then the four beasts of the Gospels come, and the different New Testament writers come. With Paul and Luke. And I know I'm going slightly out of order because we haven't talked about the Griffin. We'll talk about him in a second, and everything. And the Apostle John comes last, and all that good stuff, and crazy symbolism. If you're into some of the crazy visual stuff in Dante, this is the canto for you. And then in the middle of all of this comes a Griffin who is half eagle, half lion. You Harry Potter fans no doubt know what a Griffin is. I think there's a Griffin in Harry Potter. I don't know. And he's pulling this big chariot. Now, this is probably the most important symbol, okay? The Griffin represents Christ. And the Griffin represents Christ because it's symbolic of Christ's two natures, just as the Griffin is symbolic of, or itself has two natures, the eagle and the lion. And then the chariot is the church. And so you have this elaborate symbol that is, part of it is symbolic of the whole of Scripture, but then it's also this salvation history thing going on. The three theological virtues show up. It's all good, and all this wild and crazy stuff. Like I said, if you didn't read any of the notes, you were probably very, very confused here. This is a section that really warrants a lot of analysis and careful reading if you're going to understand it. If you miss some of that, don't sweat it. It's a confusing section the first time that you read through Dante. So, something, if you're interested, go back and reread those cantos. I believe that's 29 or 30, and you'll probably get more out of it the second or third time around. And then last but not least, Beatrice finally shows up, and she is pissed off. She is not happy with Dante. And it's an interesting scene because I think we are instinctively expecting this joyous reunion. But instead, she's angry at him, and she rebukes him a number of times over the next several cantos. It's really kind of goes against our expectations. But yet, what Dante's trying to say here is trying to show us that even in this moment, even when you've been cleansed of your sin, you've escaped purgatory and everything, there's still an aspect where you have to, before you can take that final step into the river Lethe, you have to own it. You have to acknowledge it once for all. So we've become, at least in Dante's journey, and in our journeys, if we're able to personalize what's going on here, at least become very emotional sections of the Commedia for Dante. As he is forced to realize that through his actions since Beatrice died, he has been betraying her constantly, and that this has caused pain for her, and that the things he does matter, and they have impacted others. It isn't just the only consequence wasn't just him being lost in the dark wood, but it was this effect on others of people who loved him, Beatrice, who loved him up in heaven, watching him go the wrong way. We'll talk about more of this in our Lenten or not our Lenten, our Easter reflection now in just a few moments. But it's a very humbling section. It's a very profound section, I think. And certainly one that, like I said, goes against our expectations. Then in the middle of some of Beatrice's rebukes, of course, we get the second half of this procession, in which we see the Griffin and the chariot. The Griffin, the chariot sitting there, and it's going along fine, and everything's going great. And then the eagle attacks it, and the fox attacks. I think it's the fox that attacks it. And these things are symbolic of, the way that wealth and political corruption fed into the church and caused it to go from the wrong path. Then the whore and the giant, which of course, at least the whore is symbolic of, straight out of Revelation, the whore of Babylon. And comes in and corrupts, and the church becomes something ugly and hideous, and the exact opposite of what it ought to be. But yet we also wind up with this prophecy that things are going to be okay again, and that the restoration of the church will come and that God won't abandon it. And so it's an interesting clash of both despair and horror at what we see happen in this symbolic pageantry, as well as promised hope and deliverance. And then finally, as we close out Purgatorio, Dante does pass through the two rivers. First through the river Lethe, and then a canto or two later through Untitled, as his sins are wiped from his mind, and that his good deeds are restored, and he is prepared to now enter paradise itself for what will be perhaps the most, or what perhaps is the most enigmatic but also beautiful section of the Divine Comedy, which we will begin this next week. So, as far as a reflection, it's interesting to me in this section the way that what we see going on with the church in this symbolic pageantry, where it starts well and starts as something beautiful and holy, becomes corrupted, and then is promised restoration. And in that same way, mirrors Dante's own journey in the comedy as a whole, but also in these passages where he starts out, he's been cleansed of his sin, he's in pretty good shape, and then the rebuke of Beatrice comes, and he's forced to once again confront his sin in perhaps the most real way thus far in the comedy, and then finally is promised restoration as a result. Or as symbolized through him passing through the two rivers. And it got me thinking a little bit about Dante's attitude towards the church, which I think absolutely fascinates me. And I talked about this a little bit in one of the other videos early on, but I think it bears a little bit more conversation now in light of the divine procession or pageant or whatever you want to call it. Because Dante has this attitude of the church where he absolutely believes that, in his case, the Catholic Church, but the church as a whole, we can look at this however we want. Our theology says we should look at it, but the church is something holy and ordained by God, and yet that there is deep, profound corruption in it. Some people want to look at Dante as a proto-reformer, and I as in the Protestant Reformation, and with respect to Protestant thinking, which I'm not trying to put down at all here, I think he's something far more interesting than that. If Dante had been a Martin Luther, I think he would have been a Martin Luther who stayed inside of the church as he tried to bring about and his reforms and combat this corruption. And I know that there's complicated historical factors that fed into Martin Luther leaving the church or being kicked out, however you want to look at it. We don't have time to get into all that history. Now, neither am I trying to say that Luther was wrong and Dante is right, or vice versa. Your perspective on that is probably going to depend on whether or not you're a Protestant or a Catholic, right? But yet, even if you are a Protestant and you look at Dante and say, well, that would be the wrong approach to reform. Reform needed that breaking away from the Catholic Church. Somebody like Dante who seeks reform while loving the church as the institution, there's something very profound to be learned about that, regardless of what our assessment is of what the needs were in medieval Christianity and Renaissance era Christianity. As far as whether it needed to be internal reform or something along the lines of what the reformers actually did with breaking away from the church. There's something very beautiful, though, about and profound and interesting about the idea of being able to critique the church with scathing bitterness. And I think Dante definitely puts that on display. And simultaneously loving it with everything you've got. And if we're looking for an answer in terms of why Dante is able to do this, I think we might have it in this passage, because Dante not only sees the problem in the church, he sees the problem in himself. And that to me is very profound. Dante sees that it's not just the church that is deeply corrupted and in need of this restoration. It is him, Dante, who is deeply corrupted and in need of this restoration. And this seems to me to be a very relevant observation for those of us in modern Christianity. Because you don't have to go very far to find a whole bunch of people who have decided to quit participating in Christianity, either altogether or in any organized communal sense, even at a basic level, because I just can't stand the hypocrisy anymore, or I just can't stand, other Christians. Or there's that ridiculous Gandhi quote that probably wasn't even said by Gandhi that gets thrown around all the time. I just hate that quote because I don't have time to get into it, but you know what I'm talking about. I love your Christ, but not your Christians. They're, because they're so unlike your Christ. It's like, what a self-serving quote to begin with. But I'm not going to go rant on that. It's a quote that bugs me because it gets into this attitude that I find very problematic in today's world. And I'm guilty of it sometimes. I'm sure you've been guilty of it sometimes, in which we like to kind of sit back and wag our fingers at the Christians around us. If the church would just do this differently, or they just talk about this issue more, or that issue less, or, why do we have to have so much hypocrisy, and I'm just so disgusted by the way some of our leaders behave, or the way that we don't love each other enough, or that we do this too much, or that not enough, or, you plug in any issue you want, from any perspective, left, right, or center, and you'll find people who are going to complain about the church in that way, for being too much of this or not enough of that, or failing in this area, or having this corruption or that hypocrisy. And what we don't do, and we're busy doing that, and I'm not saying that there isn't a time and a place to point out issues, of course there is. But what we tend not to do is look in the mirror. There was a church I was going to in college, and the pastor was talking about some of this stuff, and he said something I'll never forget, because I think it's a brilliant response. He said that, he has people come up to him and say, "Pastor, I can't go to church anymore. So it's just full of hypocrites." And he said that when people come up to me and say that, my response to them is, yes, the church is full of hypocrites. And there's room for one more. Of course, the person who's asking the question. I think it's a brilliant response. Because if we're going to complain about the issues in the church, rightfully or wrongfully, we need to realize we are part of those issues. You are part of the problem in the church. And I am part of the problem in the church. And our sin is part of the problem in the church. And every issue you can rattle off, you contribute to at some level, and so do I. Or you contribute to another one. We tend not to focus on the issues that we personally fail at and feel, don't contribute well to. And I think the brilliance of this passage is that it shows us a different way to do that, to handle those issues. That number one, don't be naive about the issues in the church. Because of course there's people who go to the other extreme, right? Just stick our heads in the sand. There's no problems, there's no problems, there's no problems. The church is fine, my church is fine, however we want to think about it. It's all good, and we never acknowledge the problems. We get very defensive whenever somebody points that out. And I think we can all be guilty of that sometimes too. I know I can. And so the first lesson we get from this passage is be honest about the issues. Be honest about the failings, big and small. Don't hide them. Recognize, admit the hypocrisy that is in the church, and the failings that are in the church, and the issues that we sometimes don't do this or that enough, or we do this or that too much. Be honest about it. But then the other lesson I think, that is present here in Dante is love the church unconditionally because Christ loved it first, and he died for it, and I think it goes down, and that to me goes from the universal church of all believers, past, present, and future, right down to your local parish or church. And I'm not saying there's never a time to get out of Dodge in a bad church or whatever, or that there aren't situations you shouldn't leave. But a lot of time, I think people just, get fed up and leave. And part of that is, in some cases at least, because there isn't enough love for the church, and I think that's tragic. Or people who just don't go altogether, have just given up on going to church. I think that's horrible. I think it's tragic, and I don't think it's what we're supposed to do. And then finally, and this is maybe the most important lesson of all, is realize that you are part of the problem that you see, and that just as the church as a whole is in need of restoration, and just as the church on a, denominational level, or Catholics or Orthodox, whoever, were in need of restoration, and your local church, your parish, your particular place you go on Sunday mornings is in need of restoration. You are in need of restoration. You are part of the problem. And that ought to change our perspective. And that ought to make us more willing to love the church, and also hopefully more eager to deal with our own failings that contribute to the flaws we see in the church. So, that endeth my sermon on Dante for this week. But yeah, great section. I'm really looking forward to getting into Paradiso, and I'm going to check out now. I unfortunately did not, I know I've made this mistake a couple of times, but did not double check before I started recording what we're supposed to read for this week. So, let me just go in here and see. We're through Purgatorio now. So for next week, nice and short. Wait, no. I was going to say, I thought at first it was Paradiso 1 through 5. No, 1 through 7, so still not that much. Just 7 cantos to read for that time. And that'll take us through the Moon and Mercury, the Paradiso, where the Inferno had circles, and Purgatorio had terraces, the Paradiso has different spheres. We go to all sorts of crazy planets, so it's wonderful stuff. So we'll get into all of that next time. But hopefully this has been helpful for you, and hopefully you're enjoying the read through the Divine Comedy. You're 2/3 of the way there now. Nothing to it with finishing it off. So keep at it, and I will be back next Sunday, the 19th, with Paradiso 1 through 7. Until then, I am Benny Bone, and this is the Sci-Fi Christian.